Erica was born in Portland and grew up next door to Grandma and Grandpa Naito. They instilled in her the progressive values of social justice, equality, and the importance of a profound connection with nature. Erica has worked on the Oregon Rises Above Hate, an annual event highlighting Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander issues and community. And also, she's the author of the book Portland's Audacious Champion, How Bill Naito Overcame Anti-Japanese Hate and Became an Intrepid Civic Leader. And the book's in our system, and there's a number of copies, so you can check it out. And today we're going to learn about Bill Naito, one of Portland's most impactful business and civic leaders, with a presentation including pictures and videos. And Naito's life spanned the Great Depression, World War II, and Portland's rebirth and profound growth in the 1970s until his sudden death in 1996. His name became synonymous with the dynamic civic leadership, whether growing Portland's urban tree canopy, revitalizing its downtown, or preserving historic buildings. And Naito's difficult childhood, the expulsion of Japanese Americans following Pearl Harbor, and his military service in occupied Japan left him with some great emotional turmoil that he had to work hard to overcome. And with that, I'm going to give the mic over here. There you go.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming here. This will help you with the later on with the PowerPoint.
Okay.
And, at this point, all you really need to do is hit play.
Okay. Hello. Good afternoon. I'm going to start with a short video because it's very hard to put everything he did into one space. So I have made a short video of his friends and colleagues describing him.
You know, you really can't look at the history of Portland without thinking about the Naito family. They encompass virtually half of the city's history, and over the course of the last 50 years, integrally involved with the things that have given Portland a reputation as one of America's most livable and innovative cities.
Well, I've always thought there was an irony to the fact that Bill would be chair of the Portland Multnomah County Library. E.B. McNaughton was a predecessor for that body. But E.B. McNaughton was an amazing man. He was president of Reed College back when the HUAC hearings were happening. He was an architect, albeit not a great one. But I've always thought of that as really an irony that Bill would step into these huge shoes. And actually, Bill and E.B. McNaughton had the same size shoes. I think they were both giants.
As you walk down the streets, you know, you can point to it and say, I remember Bill was pushing that thing, and, you know, there it is.
I'd been out of office for 5 years, I think, something like that, and or 3 or 4 years. And he said, what are you going to do the next 20 years of your life, you know, and what are you going to do for the city? It was always something to do with the city.
I think there probably no finer name on a street than Naito Parkway. And if you look at the founding fathers' names on many of the streets in Portland, it's great to have Naito Parkway because he is part of the foundation of this city, and it's great to have the diversity of a Japanese American in our street names.
For a city that literally asked them to leave at the start of the war, to a city that they came back to, the embracing the city did is only a result of them having embraced the city first.
He never wanted to let go of those emotions. He wanted to know that they were there. It was a powerful experience, a very important part of his life. But he was also not going to let it get in his way. He was going to make sure that in his own life, he did whatever he could to use that experience as a way of communicating positively about where we as a city or as a community or as a broader culture should head.
In spite of a really tough background, he always saw the glass as half full.
Bill saw a better world. He would always be dreaming about what was possible, dreaming right out on the edge of, well, what would happen if people could see that we were in this together.
think good thoughts that the PowerPoint will work effortlessly. All right. Bill Naito was one of the most influential civic and business leaders in Oregon's history. With Bill's help, Portland pulled itself out of a downward spiral and became an icon of livability. His constant cheerleading filled many with pride and belief. This is a great day and a great city, and we have a great future, he was often heard to say. But how Bill became a changemaker for the good was neither easy nor certain. It was a long road for the son of Japanese immigrants to become the embodiment of an Oregonian. But first, a word about pronunciation. In the video, you heard Greg Cantor refer to Naito Parkway, but if you ask Google for directions, she will tell you Naito Parkway. Which one is correct? Bill was born William Sumio Naito, but he changed the pronunciation in the 1950s to Naito. In Japanese, he was born with the first written last name in kanji, and he changed it to the second, katakana. It was a change that was partially pragmatic. Americans seemed to have a harder time with Naito than Naito. But it was also a way for Bill to distinguish himself from his parents and to define himself on his own terms. It is not that Bill rejected being Japanese, but he struggled with the connection between traditional Japanese things and his mother, with whom he had a terrible relationship. While doing business in Japan, however, he would have gone by Naito and written his name in kanji. But here in Oregon, it's Naito Parkway. Bill was born in 1925 to Hide and Fukie Naito, Japanese immigrants who had come to Portland from the same farming village outside of Kobe. They were Issei, first-generation Japanese Americans. And here is Bill on his grandmother's lap, his older brother Sam, and their mother Fukie. Bill and his brothers Sam and Albert were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. Fukie had been beyond pleased to have a firstborn son in Sam and was not planning to have more children. But if it happened, she wanted a girl. Instead, along came Bill. Not deterred by nature, she dressed Bill in girls' clothes and haircuts until he entered first grade. She also taught him to do chores that were traditionally the purview of girls, cooking and cleaning. Bill would later refer to himself at that time as Cinderfella. His mother was fastidious, bordering on obsessive-compulsive, and her obsession with perfection made him a maverick later in life, when he was known for rejecting the right way of doing things. It was a thumbing of his nose at his mother. Bill was the second son, Jinon, his brother Sam, the Chunon, firstborn. Being Chunon was the equivalent of being the golden child in a Japanese household, given every advantage as the future carrier of the family's legacy. The Naitos were no exception, and Bill and his younger brother Albert were often left to themselves as their parents focused on Sam. As the children grew up, Sam was encouraged to work in the family fine imports store, manning the front of house and learning accounting. Bill was relegated to warehouse work. In many Japanese families, this favoritism is not personal, but strictly based on tradition and cultural expectations. But Fukie seemed to genuinely dislike Bill, even from an early age, and she would call him Moriago, adopted son, when he misbehaved. She was also hypercritical of him, attributing any problems to some fundamental flaw in his character. Her mistreatment of him would lead him to have severe stuttering at times and partial paralysis of his face, giving him a crooked smile, something that she also used against him as evidence of his inherently bad nature. And this is Bill in the middle. Bill was riddled by shame, anger, and hurt at home, but it was school where he thrived. Librarians and teachers took special interest in him. helping him to overcome not knowing a single word of English when he entered first grade. School became a sanctuary away from the criticisms of his mother, and he spent many days after school at the Multnomah County Central Library, across from his father's shop. By the time he was a teenager, he was an honors student at Washington High School, and he had a chicken farming hobby to give him comfort at home. Bill's father, Hide, spent 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, working on his retail shop and developing a wholesale business, both reliant on imports from Japan. The family lived on 58th and Burnside, away from Portland's Japantown and Old Town. It was part of Hide's plan to get his children to assimilate as quickly as possible, giving them no other Japanese Americans nearby as a safety net, or any people of color at that time in the Mount Tabor neighborhood. Here is Sam in his all-white Mount Tabor grade school class. Sam was the first person of any color to attend the grade school. Hide had to buy the family home in Sam's name, as Hide was barred from owning any property in Oregon by its alien land law. Sam, on the other hand, was a U.S. citizen by birth and not barred from property ownership even as an infant. Despite the racism and general hurdles of living, Hide carved out a successful middle-class life for his family. That changed when the Empire of Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The next day, the FBI locked Hide out of his store without a warrant. They also searched the family home, going there when Fukie was alone with her extremely limited English and terrifying her as they searched the house for evidence of collusion with Japan. Of course, there was none. The Naitos weren't fifth columnists, and neither were any other Japanese Americans, and there has literally been not one instance of treason discovered among Japanese Americans. Hide was fortunate not to be illegally arrested and detained in jail in Montana, where over 2,000 of the most community-active Issei were secreted away without explanation to their families. Hide, an introvert, had never done much outside of his business, and that saved him. By the time that FDR ordered the forced removal and illegal incarceration of all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, Portland City Council had already permanently canceled all business licenses held by Japanese Americans. The Naitos had been waiting to see just how bad it would get. Beyond their worst nightmares, Executive Order 9066 gave the community only days to prepare for expulsion from within 500 miles of the West Coast. Bill was in school when he realized he had to leave.
To school, Washington High School, and I made sure it was during class, because I didn't want to see any of my friends. And I emptied out my a locker, took all my books, my gym clothes home, and took the streetcar home, and then the following day we left town. And that was that's probably one day I'll never forget. That was a tearful day, tearful, and I just couldn't say goodbye to my friends.
Why didn't you want to see them?
Humiliation. That this kind of showed that I was a sort of traitor. I couldn't be trusted. I'm not American.
Bill kept a copy of the executive order on a column by his desk for all his life, never wanting to let people forget what had been done to him. He would never bring it up himself, but if someone asked about it, he would tell them stories of that time in his life. The Naitos were among the small percentage that managed to self-relocate, and there was this brief window where if you could prove to authorities you had a location outside the zone, they would allow you to leave on your own instead of going into the camps. Fukie's sister-in-law was living in Salt Lake City, where there was a small established Japanese American community. they joined her there. They had to take back roads through eastern Oregon because the authorities forbid them from using main highways. They might do something like blow up Bonneville Dam on their way out of town. Most Japanese Americans, around 120,000, were forced into American concentration camps throughout the country, with most from Portland ending up in the Minidoka concentration camp in Idaho after a 6-month stay at the Portland Assembly Center. The Naitos were lucky in other ways most weren't, too. Hide's white landlord for his shop and basement warehouse did not cancel his lease. Instead, she allowed him to keep the store open. He gave control of it over to a white woman who had worked in it for many years. As long as she paid the rent, she was entitled to any profits above that. Because Hide had bought their home in Sam's name and they were in a white neighborhood, they were able to rent it out. Unlike most Japanese Americans, the white people the Naitos relied on kept their promises. Salt Lake was a welcome change to Bill. He didn't have to face his friends in Portland every day or face the trauma of the loss of their store or the violation of their home, both of which the FBI raided on multiple occasions. In Salt Lake, he could start over as well as anyone could. His father, on the other hand, was so devastated that he couldn't find motivation to do anything but sulk. Hide was a merchant. He was not a farmer, as many Issei were, and his merchant business had been wholly reliant on trade with Japan. Bill found a solution to give him purpose: chicken farming. Bill had been in 4-H and had taught himself chicken husbandry using the few books at the Multnomah County Library. Bill suggested that the family do it for a living. And one of the most ironic aspects of their relocation to Salt Lake was that when the hens stopped laying, they would be slaughtered and their meat sold to a local restaurant, the wildly racist Coon Chicken Inn, which was so successful that it had franchises in Seattle, Washington, and back home in Portland. The intense racism of World War II against Japanese Americans didn't come out of nowhere. To battle it, Bill enlisted after he graduated from Granite High School in Salt Lake. His parents approved, feeling that they owed America for all the opportunities they had enjoyed. Bill wanted to join the Navy, but he had to join a segregated all-Japanese American unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit, who were fighting in Europe. But Bill's intelligence got him sent to the Military Intelligence Service, which was working in the Pacific Theater doing propaganda, prisoner of war interviews, code breaking, and negotiating surrender from Japanese soldiers on the battlefields. You can see Bill in the center here sporting what would become a defining fashion of his, the sweater vest. While in Japan, Bill was able to connect with his extended family, and he helped a young Japanese student get into college in Iowa. But it was a fraught time for him emotionally. America had rejected him as an American, and the Japanese did not consider him Japanese. His family had long made him feel like an outsider. Did anyone want him? Did he belong anywhere? He was terrified of how white people would react to him when he returned home. Could he still call Portland home? All that introversion and anxiety from his difficult childhood were magnified to oppressive levels by the war. With no other option, Bill returned from service to Portland, where his parents had returned home some time before from Salt Lake. He attended Reed College on the GI Bill, where, at first, in his own words, he was pathologically shy. But a professor and a group of white fellow student GIs helped him to open up, and he fell in love with the school. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a degree in economics and moved to Illinois to attend the University of Chicago for his master's. But for all his success as a student, including writing his PhD dissertation under mentor Milton Friedman, he still felt like everything was meaningless. He was seized with self-doubt and a feeling that he didn't belong. It was a friend, Lorne Sonley, that saved him from his depression and anxiety. An English Canadian, Lorne was in the same economics program as Bill, and he had served in occupied Japan, working on agricultural issues to help feed the starving populations abandoned by the empire. It was he who suggested that Bill enlist in a psychology seminar on the acculturation of minorities. For 2 years, 4 times a week, Bill had therapy sessions. They delved into his childhood, his relationship with his mother and older brother Sam, his errant belief that he had been born wrong or bad somehow. For the first time in his life, Bill felt optimism. He felt a sense of self defined by his own terms and not his mother or the rest of his family. The man who would become Portland's most ardent and vocal optimist was born in Dr. Charlotte Babcock's office. Bill became a man that others could believe in and follow. But that wasn't all that Lorne gave to Bill. He never said it out loud, but Lorne must have known that Bill and his little sister Mickey were destined to fall in love. She came to Chicago after Lorne suggested she leave Toronto and her boyfriend there, a man who Lorne did not care for. Lorne was already in a relationship and was looking for a +1 for Bill when they went out. And how convenient that Mickey was suddenly there and available. It was love at first sight, according to Bill. Mickey was funny, smart, and independent. She had a degree in economics and political science from the University of Toronto, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. It helped that she was also short, 5'1" to make Bill's 5'4" seem a little taller. And she wasn't Japanese, which meant none of the triggers associated with his mom could crop up in their relationship. They married in 1951, when it would have been illegal to do so in Oregon under the state's miscegenation law. While Bill was crafting a life in Chicago, Hide and Sam had gotten Naito Gifts retail store back on its feet, and they'd also restarted the wholesale importing business. Bill had no intention of joining them, but instead planned to become a professor of economics like his hero Milton Friedman. But Hide and Sam were having issues with younger brother Albert in the business, and they called Bill constantly to help manage the situation. Eventually, they persuaded him that he had to come home. Reluctantly, he did. Initially, Bill was still worried about how white people would react to him in business. He used white salesmen to do the face work for him. But his own ego and desire for success eventually overtook his fears, and more he stepped out on his own. And when they initially moved back, all of them were living in Hide and Fukie's house. It was a tight squeeze, and Fukie hated my grandmother because she was white, and she was very upset that he had married a white woman, which, of course, I think made him secretly happy. In 1954, Bill went on his first buying trip to Japan, something that the Naitos did every year for the wholesale business. For the sake of the business, Bill gritted his teeth through the deep bowing and Japanese stuffiness, which reminded him of his mother. He was a shrewd buyer and helped the company to succeed and grow, but retail and wholesale were not his passion. The Naitos had their first warehouse on First Avenue in Cooch in Old Town, which was then called Skid Road. Old Town had originally been the downtown of Portland, the victim of the federal government choosing to place the courthouse and post office further south in 1867, and that was because we didn't have a proper seawall, so Old Town constantly flooded. Because of the initial weakness of the Japanese yen after the war, their wholesale business was wildly successful, bringing in tons of cash year after year. You'll notice the name Northwest Trading Company. That was one of several white-sounding names that the Naitos tried before settling on Norcrest China Company. In 1960, they moved into the 5-story Fleischner Mayer across the street. The Fleischner was the first building that the Naitos bought. In 1963, they followed it up with the Globe Hotel on First Avenue. The Globe was in bad shape, even by Skid Row standards. It had been a hotel for day laborers and indigent retirees, with chicken wire fencing over the tops of the stalls to prevent patrons from throwing their empty Mickey bottles onto the unsuspecting neighbor next door. Bill and Sam bought it for their new retail concept, Import Plaza, a way to beat San Francisco's Cost Plus to the Portland market. No one thought it would succeed because who would want to shop in a place populated by the houseless and down on their luck? Instead, it was a runaway success from the very first day. The Naitos had their first taste of being newsworthy. In the late 1960s, the dynamics of international trade started to change, and Bill and Sam turned toward Skid Row's real estate to shelter its cash profits, while also providing a more stable long-term investment. And they could buy the buildings in Skid Row for almost nothing above demolition costs because of the state of the neighborhood. And I'm going to give you some background on Skid Rows. They originated in the Civil War, when many young men were left homeless and jobless and congregated in neglected areas of cities. These became pools of unskilled labor, which were cyclically depleted and replenished by World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. And these are snapshots of a Norcrest employee around Old Town in the early 1960s. After World War II, Skid Row citizens started to skew older and were more likely to suffer alcohol and drug problems, a natural response to the untreated trauma that most men who served in World War II carried. By 1974, Portland Skid Row's approximately 2,000 residents were 95% men, 85% white, and 56% older than 55 years of age. They were also 11 times more likely to suffer alcoholism than other Multnomah County residents. But the residents made the buildings cheap buys, so it was a sound investment for purely economic reasons. But it was also deeply personal. Skid Row had been the home of Nihonmachi, Japantown, before Pearl Harbor. While the Naitos lived far away on the east side, they often went down to Nihonmachi, where their dentist and doctor were, and where Fukie did her Japanese grocery shopping. Executive Order 9066 eradicated the neighborhood, and there were few traces of it left. The Japanese American community had been kicked out of the city, and now Bill and Sam, two Japanese Americans, were buying Nihonmachi back. It was an act of reclamation. And they weren't just buying the buildings. They were at the forefront of a nationwide movement to preserve and restore historic buildings, like the Merchant Hotel here, which was slated for demolition when the Naitos bought it in 1968. And this is a snapshot of when they bought it. It had been the heart of Nihonmachi, and it was set to become a surface parking lot. Instead, its cast iron storefronts were restored, and its top floors filled with architects, graphic designers, and artists. It was the beginning of Old Town's revival, in a pattern that the Naitos replicated throughout the area. And I'm just going to give a sample of the buildings because you could see there were quite a few from the map. So this is the Skidmore Monchalin blocks on First and Burnside. That's on the back side of the White Stag building. The Shoreline block on Burnside, and the Erickson Saloon across the street. Foster Place on 2nd and Davis. Some of you might remember Daisy Kingdom. And the Deacon Building on 3rd and Washington. While the Naito brothers were redeveloping Skid Row, the core of downtown Portland to the south was having problems of its own. Everything revolved around cars, leading to horrific air quality. No one lived downtown. People who worked downtown never stayed after hours. On the weekends, it was a ghost town. Retail was leaving to Lloyd Center and Washington Square Mall. It felt like a slide that could not be stopped. But not to Bill and Sam, who took the risk of buying the vacant Rhodes building, originally the Olds and King department store. They got it for a song, $565,000 when it was valued at least $1 million. But Rhodes just wanted to be rid of it. It was costing them $10,000 a month, and the market was dead. There was no other foreseeable buyer. Bill wanted to get Nordstrom to fill it, but when he went up to convince Bill Nordstrom in Seattle, he was so good at selling the city that Nordstrom came down and bought an entire city block for himself. What to do with theirs? Turn it into the first vertical mall in the West, populated by local small businesses and first-time entrepreneurs. It was a smashing success, and it also held personal satisfaction for Bill, who noted at the time where once his father was banned from owning a single inch of property, his 2 sons now owned a city block. By this time, Bill and Mickey had 4 children. They had moved into the Denthorpe neighborhood in the early 1960s to accommodate the family's expansion, hiring famed architect Van Evra Bailey to design it in the Northwest regional style. The style was pioneered by Bailey, Pietro Bellusci, and John Yon in the 1930s. It was typified by the use of wood and the elimination of roof trusses and ceiling finish. Bailey focused on creating a seamless relationship between the interior and exterior, often with floor-to-ceiling windows. And you can see here, this is one side of the house, and you can see through. And that's for, I would say, about 2/3 of the house possible. The core principle was creating a symbiotic relationship between the environment and a building, rather than the imposition of a building upon its surrounding. And this is another shot decades later, and that's my cat White Sox, which is the most important thing in this picture. The house included a wraparound fireplace made of Mount Adams rock. And you can see here where Bill is standing. Again, there's a window there where you can see outside, and there's giant floor-to-ceiling windows on this side. Bailey was considered an architect to the stars, and in Bill's own words, quote, a real man's man who loved wine, women, and all good things. According to Saul Zeich, a fellow architect in the Northwest Regional style and designer of Bill's beach house in Salishan, Bailey was fairly conservative. Quote, so I don't know how he and Naito got along. But knowing Naito pretty well and knowing Van well, I can just imagine some of the language that might have gone on between them. But they both shared a zest for life and a desire to eschew formalities and the expected. As described by J. Kingston Pierce, Van was, quote, the guy who scored highly among national design critics, yet would spend his weekends drunk as the proverbial skunk shooting at floating light bulbs in the Willamette River. It is easy to see how they would get along, especially considering Bill's own proclivity for alcohol and the rejection of behaving how a person of that sort should act. But despite the beautiful surroundings and the 4 rambunctious children, Bill's focus was on work. Just like He-Day, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. 30 minutes in the garden in the morning, followed by 15 minutes with the kids at the breakfast table, and then not home until dinner time at 7. After the children graduated high school, Mickey went to work in the Galleria as its leasing manager because she felt if she wasn't part of the business, she wasn't part of the family. It was not easy being married to a man like Bill. You see, Bill was motivated by vengeance. He was angry about what had been done to him, about how white society had rejected and betrayed him. And he was going to make sure that they knew it. How? By being the best businessman, the best civic leader, the best Portlander that they knew. He was going to make them choke on regret for having ever doubted him. But he would never let them know. He was going to smile his way through it. It reminds me of the Japanese myth of the 3 hearts. Bill's first heart, his public-facing heart, was one of optimism and hope, undying faith in the citizens of Portland and its future, ever striving for a better day for everyone. His more intimate heart, the one for his friends and family, was more crass and realistic, but always laughing, even if he was describing his painful childhood. His hidden heart, the one that he never showed anyone, was shame, rage, hurt, and self-doubt. The feelings of his hidden heart propelled him to compulsively seek success and public importance. Family matters were secondary, and he trusted Mickey completely to raise their children almost by herself. I'm going to read a direct quote of Bill's, and I want you to compare what you see with what he told his therapist in 1980 in a follow-up to the psychological seminar that he did back in Chicago. I feel like I should take punishment as a samurai would, with a smile. There are these bastards out there trying to do us in, and I go out there and fight these bastards like a samurai. It actually gives me strength to accomplish what I do and to take on frustration much easier. The Galleria launched the Naitos into household names, and a separation soon began to take place, in which Bill became the more known brother. It was not an easy change for Sam to take, being chewed on, and there had always been friction between the two of them since the earliest days. In the beginning, they had held their arguments in Japanese, thinking that none of their employees could understand them. Once that embarrassingly proved false, they tried to keep their arguments to a minimum. By the late 1980s, they communicated largely through written notes. But their devotion to the business trumped personal animosity, and they somehow managed to continue to grow the company in spite of it. And they both knew how to put on a face, a Japanese art form. Bill's success with the Galleria whet his appetite for greater endeavors, resulting in McCormick Pier Apartments in 1982. It was the only build from the ground up for Norcrest, and it was happening in a bad recession for the city and state. But Bill thrived on risk, and he loved a challenge. His success meant more when he wasn't supposed to. Again, this is part of that rapacious desire to prove white society wrong. McCormick Pier was the first new housing in downtown for years. It was also the first workforce housing in downtown. And it represented a fifth of the housing goal for the entire city. Many people thought that being a Naito meant huge trust funds and million-dollar bank accounts. But Bill and Sam's wealth came from their intense penny pinching. That meant Bill would take home the bent dimes from the money counting machine and hammer them flat at the dining room table every evening. He would also take his home garbage down to McCormick Pier and toss it in the dumpster there so he didn't have to pay residential garbage fees. Norcrest headquarters were in the White Stag warehouse. No corner offices, no partitions between the 3 rows of desks, and absolutely no renovations to the space. If you remove the desks, it would have been a working warehouse the next day. My grandpa and I once argued over the 50-cent difference between a Belgian waffle and unlimited regular waffles at the buffet. 50 cents. 5 minutes. I got the Belgian waffle, but it was a struggle. But the parsimony is how their historic renovations were successful. Take, for instance, Alber's Mill, a grain mill from the early 1900s. By the time the Naitos bought it in 1983, it was a festering mold factory with an obscene nutria population feeding on the rotting grain. There was so many nutria that a bunch of peregrine falcons and owls had made their roosts in there because they could easily just go down and get lunch. It was a huge undertaking. But Bill's intense Scroogeism is how they were able to take a disintegrating grain mill, literally crumbling into the Willamette River, and create a one-of-a-kind historic reservation without going bankrupt. For example, a concrete wall stood north of the building, $50,000 to remove it. Instead, Bill and urban planner Rick Gustafson created the Gus Natoson Fountain, running a hose over the top to create a water feature. Even the water cost nothing, as it was taken directly from the Willamette. The only cost was the pump and hose. The most iconic building that Bill rescued and converted was Montgomery Park, a former Montgomery Ward warehouse. And why did he buy a giant warehouse in a part of Portland that was industrial and turn it into an office building of 1 million square feet of marketable space? Because the city's development commission had rejected Norcrest's bid to develop a condo and apartment project on the south end of the waterfront a year earlier. It was one of the only times that Bill's colleagues and friends could remember him visibly angry. After all he had done, they still doubted him? Montgomery Park was unavoidable proof, literally unavoidable proof, if you look at the skyline, of his greatness. And he risked the entire company to do it, having to sell a building for the first time in the company's history to make a mortgage payment. But it proved to be his greatest achievement, business-wise. Because a lot of what he did had nothing to do with his business. As noted in the video, there are many things that define Portland that are because of Bill. The Multnomah County Library system as we know it, as well as the renovation of its central library in the early 1990s. The plaque pictured was placed in the lobby after his death. He credited all of his success to the library, its librarians, and to reading, believing that people should pay a sin tax for watching TV in the evening instead of reading. There was an exception, and that was if you were watching MASH, which was his favorite show. Pioneer Square, Portland's living room, threw a critical donation in support of it as an open square. It was dangerously close to becoming a large parking lot or, and I'm not joking, an enclosed butterfly aviary. The square's Christmas tree every holiday season, which cost another $140,000 to create the load-bearing capacity. But Bill loved Christmas. He loved the city, and he knew how much the tree would bring the people together every year. And here I will point out that is one of the things that made Bill different from other civic leaders of his time, you know, Glenn Jackson, people like that. Bill's touchstone was always what the people of Portland would want. He rarely, if ever, made decisions that didn't profit the public. And in his own business projects, there was always a direct benefit to the community at large. The White Stag sign, the symbol of Portland, which Bill had preserved as an historic landmark in 1977, the first such sign in Portland history. In the 1980s, it was turned off when the owner ended the lease. Bill personally vowed to have it turned back on in time for the holiday season, assuring a very worried public that Rudolph would still fly over the city, even if he had to reach into his pockets to do it, which, a very rare occasion, he did. Waterfront Park, which he suggested that the city extend all the way to Old Town. It took 20 years for the city to get to where he was in 1970 when he submitted this sketch to the planning offices. Before that, he was a fierce advocate for the removal of Harbor Drive and the Oregon Journal building from the waterfront, pushing for the city to have a people-friendly, active waterfront like the one in Chicago that he had enjoyed in grad school. Fairless Square, in which mass transit was free in the downtown core. The route light rail took through downtown on First Avenue. Vintage trolleys that rode upon the tracks. He was consistently the only leader who argued against cars and advocated for a city based on people rather than vehicles. Preserving the entire quadrant of Skid Road with his brother Sam and renaming it Old Town in 1975, painting the water tower on his own initiative. The picture is of Bill standing outside of Norcrest's popular Import Plaza store, not only the only new retail in years in the area when it opened in 1963, but it was retail geared towards suburban white women. If you build it, he argued, they will cross Burnside to get there. And he did just about everything he could to get people into the district. perpetuating the Shanghai Tunnels myth, the story that young men were soaked with booze, taken down into the basement, and kidnapped for service on ships along the waterfront. It's completely untrue, but he pushed it relentlessly. Giving museums free rent in his buildings. Advertising for the entire neighborhood and not just Norcrest shops. When the Transit Mall was under construction in the late 1970s, Bill bought a double-decker bus from Washington Square Mall. I don't know why the mall had the bus. And it would go downtown and bring people to Old Town. He made maps for self-guided walking tours. And when the urban tour group started, he convinced them that Old Town was safe for children. Saturday Market, an arts and crafts fair started by two young women that Bill allowed to use the parking lot behind the Fleischner Mayer every Saturday, starting in 1974. He was the last in a long line of property owners they had approached, all of whom had said no. Bill was not afraid of retail competition or hippies, the constant villain in the eyes of many Portland leaders in the 1970s, and I'm not being facetious. Like Frank Ivancy was terrified of them. Urban trees, which were an anathema to much of the business community when he started planting them in the sidewalks of Old Town in 1963. His chairmanship of the Urban Forestry Commission for 20 years ended only by his death in 1996. He oversaw the planting of over 30,000 trees. Putting up and maintaining hanging baskets in Old Town on Norcrest's dime. Stopping the city from putting in Cobra freeway lights in Old Town Chinatown and instead getting historic ornamental lights put in. His deathbed wish for the Lansu Chinese Garden project to be completed, and it was a literal deathbed wish. Mayor Vera Katz called him in the hospital and said, "What can I do?" And he said, "Build the garden." It is no wonder that he was often caught sleeping in public, even at his own wedding reception and banquets in which he was the honored guest. There was so much to do to prove that white society had been wrong, that he was the best of them, and that his parents were wrong, that he was the best of their sons, and to prove it to himself. After all, he referred to his own life story as a little Japanese boy comes good. Out of all he did, it was the Japanese American Historical Plaza that he considered the only important thing I've ever done, because it was vital to him to memorialize the wrong that had haunted him for 50 years, the T for traitor on his face. But it would also memorialize the resilience of the Japanese American community, how it was the embodiment of the American dream. From the first Issei who arrived, and the stone reads, "Mighty Willamette, beautiful friend, I am learning, I am practicing to say your name." To the families and children unjustly imprisoned in concentration camps, and the Nisei soldiers who died defending an American ideal betrayed. To those who returned to make the city theirs once again. With new hope, we build new lives. Why complain when it rains? This is what it means to be free. And to honor a country that was willing to publicly admit to a mistake and apologize. This is President Ronald Reagan's apology on behalf of the country for Executive Order 9066 and what was done to Japanese Americans as a result. This reinforced Bill's unfailing belief in American exceptionalism. He had an insane amount of patriotism. Despite being a multi-millionaire real estate mogul and one of the most famous Oregonians of his time, Bill guided tours through the plaza, helping visitors to understand what he and his community had endured and overcome. The plaza was what had been missing his entire life and was only possible because of all the connections and goodwill that he had built throughout his career. It was as if it had all been leading to this memorial all along. And you can see his trademark Mr. Rogers fashion. Hide Naito arrived in Portland in 1917 with almost no money, a little English, and the hope of building something more than was possible in his small village in Japan. He ended up giving the city of Portland and the state of Oregon two of its greatest sons and advocates. Bill always had a struggle with his father, a mix of deep admiration but also a competitive desire to show him up and prove his worth as a son. Bill's success and influence was the culmination of the American dream of his father, his own personal turmoil, his anger at the white society that had hurt him, and his own personality as a never-say-die believer that the future could always be better. You just had to keep striving. And for all that he accomplished, he was at his happiest when in nature, hiking in Canada or sitting on a beach, his dog at his feet, a book in his hand, and his wife at his side. When he knew he was dying in 1996, he requested that the following poem by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe be read. Your fortunate eyes, what all you have seen, may it be as it will. It was lovely to me. Thank you. If anyone has any questions. No? Yeah. So, most of the book is not my personal experience. We initially, my editor and I, tried to include some of my memories, but my goal was to tell his story as neutrally as possible. And so what I did instead is I have 12 4-inch binders, 12 of them, with articles, letters, corporate documents. I tried to verify everything as an academic researcher would. And then I had what I call Bill dinners, where I would have kind of a group of his colleagues. So like there was kind of the government group, and that was like Mike Lindbergh and David Judd of the Urban Forestry Commission and Bob Ames. And I make this opulent meal, and I had lots of wine, and I would just turn on my recorder on my phone and let them talk to each other. And we did that for an employees dinner where they all told each other stories. And the thing about Bill was that everyone has a Bill story. If you knew him, there was always that one moment where you were like, oh my gosh, that is so Bill. And so they were feeding each other, you know, tell one story that would lead to another story. And then my job was first to transcribe it and then to fact check. You know, so if someone said something, then I had to try and find. And luckily, a lot of this time period was two main newspapers, the Oregonian and the Oregon Journal. So I had a lot more to draw from than I would now. I cannot imagine what it's like now with the Oregonian, 60% syndicated news. So, you know, I loved him desperately. I was his favorite grandchild. I grew up next door to him. So I saw him 4 or 5 times a week. But that's not the story I was telling. So, thank you.
I'm relatively new to the area. Can you give me some update on, are all this property still within the family business? Has things fragmented?
So my grandpa's ego was quite sizable, and the original succession plan was both brothers had 50% of the controlling shares, and when one brother died, their estate would give one of those controlling shares to the surviving brother, and then they would have control. And it was an insane idea because it assumed that all the children would get along, or all the children would get along with the surviving uncle, right? And so his children begged him many times, please, can we change this? But he wouldn't, because he thought he would outlive Sam. So he was like, why would I change something that's going to benefit me directly? And so when he died, the thing that everyone was afraid of happened, which is that my uncles did not get along with Sam, and Sam's younger brother did not get along with my uncles, and there started this infighting, which could have totally been avoided. You know, my great uncle Sam is still alive. He's 103. 103. So my grandfather did a major miscalculation. And his, you know, their father had lived to be 93. I mean, he had this expectation. He didn't factor in the fact that he drank like a fish, and the human body can only take so much. And he loves cigars. Yeah, it was a double whammy. So yeah, the company split, and then it split some more, and the buildings have been sold, and yeah, Montgomery Park just got sold for like 20 million, 37 million. We sold it for 119. Okay, I don't know. I don't care about that stuff. So it was originally for Bill, and it actually was called Bill Naito Parkway. But then the city worried about Sam's reaction, and so they changed it to Naito. But it's for Bill. Yeah, I have one of the original versions of the sign. So, yeah. You know, it's complicated. Sam was a very important man in his own right, and he did a lot of things, but he was not Bill. He was a very traditional businessman. You know, if Bill was on your board, you ended up laughing until you cried. He came out with crazy ideas. He supported you insanely, you know, all this energy. And Sam was a traditional businessman who was sat on your board, who would have offered good advice, but didn't have the personality. Bill had a personality that grabbed people. I was afraid of Sam. So in Norcrest, my grandfather and Sam didn't pay anybody living wages, so you couldn't afford childcare. But the trade-off was you could bring your kids. So if you had a baby, you could put a crib next to your desk and have your baby. And so there were lots of Norcrest babies, and I was one of them. And I would run up and down the aisles but every time I got to Sam, I would be like, and I don't know if you remember Karate Kid Part 2, which I watched like a million times. But I always thought Grandpa was Mr. Miyagi, and Sam was, I forget his name, Kato or whatever his name was anyway. Because visually they are like, Grandpa looked more like Mr. Miyagi, and Sam looked more like the other guy. Anyway, you should rewatch it. Aside from casting some Chinese people as Japanese people, it's a very good film. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I kept waiting for someone else to write it, right? Look at all that he did, you know, and it wasn't a secret. It's not like I had to wrench it out of people. People love to tell you it, but somehow the book was not getting written. And I do think that is a function of the institutionalized racism in Portland, where it's just white people come to mind first. And so it's not necessarily anti-Japanese. It's more that you think about, like, history blog writers love to write about colonizers, you know, Captain Cooch or whatever, but they're not as likely to write about persons of color. And so it's just kind of an inherent bias that feeds itself. I will say Earl Blumenauer read this. I had not talked to him on the phone before, but he called and left me a voicemail saying how incredible the book was, and he's planning to give it to all the new city council members. And the mayor. One of the things is we're far enough away from the 50s and 60s that people don't remember how terrible it was. And so you would think right now we're at 0, maybe -1. It's so bad out there. And they have no clue, because the 50s and 60s were that was 0. That was actual 0, where there were days where our air quality was the worst in the world. In the world. Where, I hate to say his name, but, you know, Mayor Goldschmidt approached Hilton to put in a new hotel, and they were like, are you insane? Nobody goes there. I mean, and so I think it's a good perspective. And also what we were fighting, the intransigence, the status quo, it was overcome. And so I think leaders now need to be reminded for perspective. And the thing that made Bill exceptional was that he believed no matter what. And he believed in the people of Portland to know themselves and to make the right decision. He trusted them. He had faith in them. And and one of the things in the 50s and 60s was very top down. You know, the city would make a decision for a neighborhood, not tell the neighborhood, start doing it. Neighbor would go up and say, what's happening? And they'd say, oh, I don't know, man. Talk to, you know, whatever. Call this number. So the thing that was exceptional about the 1970 City Council is it became the opposite. It became inclusive. You brought neighborhood associations into the bureaucracy to give them a direct voice. And now we've kind of swung back where the city doesn't trust people to know what they want. And then you have that distrust that builds where you don't like any of your choices, right? You don't like any of your people. You don't trust decisions they make. And then you add social media, which my grandfather would have absolutely hated. He would have reviled the phones. There's this pressure to do everything perfectly the first time. And the thing about the 70s was they were taking risks. They didn't know. You know, they were going around to Minneapolis, and they were going around to see, like, what can we do? Will it work here? We don't know. We're going to try. And it's okay if it doesn't work. We'll change it. The original downtown plan was too cumbersome. It was on one hand too specific, but on the other hand too vague. So they had to redo it. That's okay. You know, Bill was a try. Try it first. Try it because it's a good idea. Try it because there's a need that needs to be met. And then if it doesn't work, we'll figure something else out. Nothing is permanently bad. Nothing is irreversible. He had so many crazy ideas. I had a whole chapter called Bill and His Crazy Ideas, but my editor was like, this is a little intense of a concentration. Because he thought, well, for juvenile delinquents, you buy a big barge and you put it in the middle of the Columbia River so that it's far enough on each side you can't swim to shore unless you're, you know, an Olympic swimmer. And then you have, you know, gardens, and the juvenile delinquents get to all hang out with each other on this barge and grow their own food and have their own little colony and figure things out, you know. And to him, dead bang serious. He thought he was obsessed with fire hydrants taking up a parking space. I think he honestly laid in bed at night and thought about the money that the city was losing because he had calculated it. He had gone around the city and figured every fire hydrant. And then he said, well, why don't we just turn the fire hydrant so the hose can kind of go around, turn it 90 degrees so it can go around the car. Well, everyone said that was stupid. So then he said, well, and this is where his Milton Friedman free market insanity comes in. Although, you're kind of like, well, actually, he asked a question. How many times is there a fire? How many cars would the fire department, so his idea was this. The cost of paying a person to break their car windows to run the hose through is less than the revenue you're generating from that parking spot. So you would empower the police to break 2 windows to run the hose through. And yeah, you would pay the person to replace the windows. I mean, what does that cost? Like $300? I don't know. 1980s dollars, I have no idea. But, he had calculated the revenue. And it was going to vastly outweigh the cost of paying the 2 windows. And, I mean, it kind of makes sense. I can think of like one fire in the last year in downtown. And think about the parking situation. Good God. I think we need to be reminded that vision is good. That bold visions are good. That we're in the worst timeline for reals. I think the bubonic plague timeline was probably the worst, but we're close. And it's very easy to get stuck in that mindset. And he brought joy to every meeting, to every conversation. And he lifted people's spirits. And it didn't get him money. It wasn't manipulative. It was genuine. Because why? Because he had no joy as a kid. Because he had struggled so hard to feel accepted and to feel optimism. So what did he do as an adult? He gave it to every single person he met. Anybody who asked for it, he was there for. And it's very rare for a wealthy person. If we look around right now, you see a bunch of inward-looking jerks. And Bill was the opposite. And so I give these talks to tell his story, but also to remind people it is possible to fix problems. It is possible to support each other. It doesn't have to be the way it's been. And that was his message. And that's why he always said, great was his favorite adjective. Every meal we had, isn't this great rice? Isn't this great teriyaki chicken? Whatever. But he always said at his meetings, it's a great day in a great city, and we have a great future. And he absolutely meant it. So I think we need to ground ourselves in some hope. Realistic hope. Anyway, that's my little stump speech. Well, that's just straight up anti-Asian racism. So No, so if you think about it, if you look at cinema and TV through, the 20th century, there were these archetypes for Asian men. So you were either Bruce Lee, the meditative warrior, or you were the nerdy calculator. It was very hard to find, unless you were in a Akira Kurosawa film, a Asian man who had more than just one dimension. It was really hard. And it's recently changed. Like Shang-Chi, holy smokes. We had a comic book character, and not only that, but they spoke Chinese at the beginning of the film. It was like, holy crap, because when you look back, especially in the 80s when we were in the fight with Japan business-wise, right? The car wars. The archetype you see is very one-sided. And it's very hard to find just regular Asian American people, right? It's just really hard to see that on screen. We're seeing it now. And that's, I think, due to a demographic shift where Asian Americans are going to be the biggest minority in this country in 2050. And money drives everything. So, but my partner, who is white, he's Irish, he always laughs because he knows if I see an Asian actor playing a character that's not necessarily Asian, I'm going to lose it with joy. Spider-Man's best friend is Native Hawaiian. The character isn't written Native Hawaiian. It would have been played by a white guy 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I feel like Marvel's been going forever. And so it's really hard for society to see Asians a certain way. March. I published in March. But think about it. He was 5'4". It's really hard to cast a 5'4" Japanese American man to play him, right? It's because that's our conception is based on tall, blonde, white men. Those are the heroes, right? And so that's what we kind of fight against. We've made big strides. As a Well, he wanted public transportation to be 100% free. He thought you could use parts of a gas tax, parts of car registration. But you need to call him Bill Naito because that's who he was. I didn't even know Naito was an option. until he died. And then my great uncle Sam went back to calling himself Sam Naito. And I told my mom, like, what's wrong with Uncle Sam? And she was like, oh, actually, that's how the name really is. Because he was ultra American. He was not going to let us suffer for our ethnicity. And so it sounds strange, but I did not think of him as Japanese when I was growing up. He was kind of like Santa Claus, where he was like this larger than life person who loved me so much. And so it's strange to look now when I'm like, he's very clearly Japanese. But for me, he was grandpa. I would say one of the things Portland likes to do and Oregon is to pretend that we're not as racist as we are. And that's it. You know, like, oh, we were on the side of the North. I remember learning that in high school. Like, we were on the side of the North because we didn't want slavery, because we didn't want black people at all. It was like we didn't even want them as slaves. We were a sundown state. In our Constitution, you could bring your slave. You could be a black person who came in, but you had to be across the border by the time the sun went down. And so that's, you know, and what happened to the Japanese, the precursor was what happened to the Chinese. And so it's, you know, we like to think of ourselves a certain way because we're not as obvious. You know, we're not in your face, but that's because we made sure there were so few minorities to begin with. You didn't have the same dynamic in the South where maybe 30% of your city was black or 40%, right? And there's that constant engagement with people of color. We didn't have that here because we intentionally, and it wasn't just people of color. Scandinavians had a really hard time in the beginning. They weren't white enough. Jews weren't white enough. Catholics weren't white enough. Basically, in Portland and Oregon, you had to be from New England. You had to be a Protestant from New England, and then you got a pass. And literally everyone else. And I when I think of the Scandinavians, how would you even know? Right? Like, you know, when World War I, oh, we were real bad against Germans. People of German descent. You know, we changed a bunch of names of our streets. We changed how we called food. And think about all the German families that are so impactful in our city. And that was a really difficult time for them. And the owner of Alber's Mill, he went to jail for treason because he sang the German national anthem drunk on a train. And boy, that's just not okay in a world war against Germans. So he was tried for treason, and he was convicted. So I think Bill serves to remind us of the racism, but also it's not fatal. And the acknowledging of it is the way we start addressing it and overcoming it. And that's hard for Portlanders because we're very passive aggressive, and we struggle mightily with cognitive dissonance, our perception of ourselves versus the reality of ourselves. And so that's also part of what I'm trying to do. We got exceptional gifts from my grandfather, but it was at the cost of extreme trauma. And he was a terrible dad because he wasn't around, because he cared more about satisfying that trauma. And so it's a give and take. Oh, very good. Very good. Yeah. I mean, it's a dangerous book to write because many of his colleagues are still alive. So I'm telling stories and, you know. So no, everyone who knew Bill knew he was complicated, and they appreciate me putting it into a framework and a narrative where they can both remember the fun things, but also, lament his hard times. I mean, people have reached out to me. He did something where he went to area high schools starting in the 50s when he came back, and he would say, who's an honors student who can have a part-time job and keep their grades up? And the counselors would work, and they would work at Norcrest, and it became known as the Norcrest School of Economics because, yes, you worked in the warehouse, but you also had to sit at Bill's desks and have him orate things at you and impart wisdom. And many of those people have reached out to me to say thank you. So, yeah, I mean, I imagine Vern isn't like super stoked about the book, but I haven't heard from him.
Do you know what happened to the majority of the Japanese families who were sent to camps and essentially deported at the time of the Second World War? Did most of them come back, like the Naito family, or very few?
I don't think it was a 50-50 split, but many went into the Midwest. So one of the camps was in Alabama. So they were in the South, New York. My grandpa in Chicago, there were many Japanese Americans. There's a very strong Japanese American community there now because the Midwest just didn't have a tenth of the racism that California, Washington, and Oregon had. And the thing is, they were leaving those camps with nothing. I mean, they probably had some dishes and their clothes, but almost all of them were renters. So when Executive Order 9066 came down, it wasn't like my family where we had a home that was in our name and we could like leave stuff in the basement, right? Because even though we were relocating to Salt Lake City, the same rules applies as camps. One suitcase, one duffel bag. Even though we were... So most people left the camp with $25 and no idea what to do. And the other thing is, especially in Hood River, there was a very big anti-Japanese movement, and there were people holding signs, Japs go away, when they got off the trains. So a lot of people made the choice, why would I subject myself to that? My great-grandpa was a very singular man. Most of the heads of households went to the camps because they thought it was the right thing to do, because they thought it would prove their loyalty. And Hide was like, no, absolutely. Like, it's absolutely not happening. And it's just, he was the firstborn son. So him leaving his family was already kind of iconoclastic. So we were very fortunate. We were very fortunate. Well, so this is what I call it. I call it the Will Smith syndrome, where Will Smith has become so famous he's no longer black. He's Will Smith. Until he slapped the guy, and then he became black, right? He went back to being black, but he was Will Smith. There's a point at which you supersede, like The Rock. I think a lot of white people don't know he's Pacific Islander, don't know the importance of that. But I do because I care a lot about that, right? And so I'm keyed into the things he does with that. But if you're a white person who doesn't care, he's just big muscles and a big toothy grin and entertaining. And so I think for Grandpa, it kind of became that way where he kind of was larger than life. And, you know, he dressed like Mr. Rogers, and he had that crooked grin, and he was kind of a character. And I'm not saying that they didn't love him, and, you know, but it just was different. He and Sam were almost always the first person of color on every board they served on. And so all the pictures from the 60s, 70s, 80s, it's a bunch of white dudes and then like this tiny little Japanese man.
all of the clubs, the private clubs, they were instrumental in being the first people of color to be invited. And my father wasn't a clubby. He didn't like going to play golf. He thought golf was, he'd go pick up golf balls at Salichan in the mud. He'd pick up the golf balls that people would lose, and then we'd wash them off. He'd have us all out there picking up golf balls, and then he'd go sell them. So,
Well, so Uncle Sam in 1979 was the first person of color in the Arlington Club. I mean, I always, you know, I ask people, I'm like, when do you think the City Club allowed women into their Friday talks? Early 80s? 1992. And it was after a year of women picketing every Friday talk, a frickin' year. So when we think about of ourselves as a very progressive open place, we need a little gut check on that one. Yeah, 1992, I was 12 years old, and women finally got to go to the talks. Yeah. I know. And that's part of what's in the book, is me just reminding people where we were. You can't ever know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And a lot of people, the majority of people who live here now were not born here. They've moved here. And so somebody told me that Portland feels like a place without context. And so I'm trying to provide context. I've been to Florida, and I'm not going back. That is not, yeah. We need that Bugs Bunny where he saws off Florida and it floats into the Gulf. Anyway, I think if that's it. Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening.
So that was a great presentation. We really appreciate it. And the program tonight was brought to you by the Friends of the Lake Oswego Public Library. And the Friends are a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing enhanced support for library projects of community interest. And they are pleased that you're participating in this library program. And we'd love for you to know more about the Friends and the great programs they support, such as the Summer Library Challenge, music and author events, monthly trivia nights, and the fabulous Lake Oswego Reads program. Visit the Friends website to learn more about their work, including the Booktique used bookstores. There's a Booktique down in City Hall, which you've probably seen, and how you can join them in supporting the library. And over there behind Nasser there is a table, and it has a bunch of event surveys. And you can fill that out with those heinous little golf pencils and tell us what you thought of today's event. And we really appreciate it. It was a great presentation. Really nice. It was really awesome. Yeah. Really good. You're a great speaker, too. It's really impressive.
Thank you. Well, my grandpa wanted me to be the first woman president, which was no pressure. And then he said, I'll settle for you being a U.S. senator.